How many people here are concerned about eating genetically engineered foods? All right. How many people here are farmers? How many? Thank you, farmers. Thank you, farmers. How many are gardeners? How many people here eat? Not everyone. I want to sort of get into your head before I fill it with some stuff. I want to kind of figure out why you come here. How many people have been here before to another conference? Many of you. So when you leave the conference, or when you hear the kind of conspiracies and ways that people are manipulating us, how many people feel anger? All right. How many people feel sad? How many people feel fear? How many people feel joy? And how many of you tend towards feeling like a victim? And how many of you tend towards feeling like a victor? All right. So I'm going to give you some really intense information, because this information is very personal. This information is about foods you've been eating for years and maybe affecting you right now, and your children, and your children's children, and maybe all future generations. So this is very, very intimate information. So I want you to think how you want to digest this information, because it's all there. There's opportunities to feel fear and anger and sadness and joy, and you can choose to feel like a victim. But I'm going to encourage you. I'm going to set a trajectory for all of us to feel like victors, for all of us to decide to take responsibility and actually do something. I have an agenda for you, okay? My agenda is to activate, to take that energy, whether it be anger or fear or sadness, and to give you an opportunity to digest it and convert it into activism. Very simple activism. Activism you can do in your own circle, whether your circle is just your family and a few friends, or whether you have a huge network. Because I've done the work to give you some information that you can spread, like putting dye at the headwaters of the Ganges, and it goes out throughout India. I was just in India, so I use that. Could have said Mississippi. I'm from Iowa. Yeah. So what I'm going to do first is start with some good news. Then I'm going to get into the really bad news. Then I'm going to get to the good news. So it's a sandwich. So if you leave in the middle, you're going to be really depressed. All right. So how many people have heard of bovine growth hormone? All right. So Monsanto, and we'll hear a lot about that company, Monsanto developed a genetically engineered bacteria, E. coli, with genes from cows to produce bovine growth hormone injected into the cows to increase milk supply. Now, it also does a lot of things to the cow's health. It increases mastitis, which is a painful infection of the udder, and so there's more pus in the milk. And because there's more pus in the milk, the dairy has to inject the cows with more antibiotics, so there's more antibiotics in the milk, and there's more bovine growth hormone in the milk, and there's more IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1, which is linked to cancer. We have IGF-1, cow's milk has IGF-1, we drink more milk, we get more IGF-1. Those with high levels of IGF-1 have higher risks of cancer. Premenopausal women below the age of 50 with high levels of IGF-1 are 7 times more likely to develop breast cancer. High levels in men, 4 times increased risk in prostate cancer. It's linked to lung and colon cancer. And it's in much higher levels in milk from cows treated with bovine growth hormone, also called RBGH, also called RBST. So a few of our organizations set out on a plan to engineer a tipping point, to engineer a rejection of bovine growth hormone. And it was very simple. Teach people how dangerous it is and allow them to choose the alternatives. And so what has happened is, starting 2005 or 6, dairies are rushing to rid their bottled milk of artificial growth hormones. It could be a tipping point. September '06, Boston Globe. The next month, New York Times, it seems to be an explosion in the industry. Walmart, Kroger, Starbucks, about 40 of the top 100 dairies rejected RBGH in the last 2 years. Last month, General Mills announced a commitment to make yolk plate RBGH free by August 1st. Not to be outdone, Dannon followed the next week. So this was an engineered tipping point. It was so simple. It is much simpler than handling almost any of the other subjects that you are hearing about this weekend, because we have an immediate effect by making healthier choices. And with this, we did not have to, it wasn't grape pickers. We didn't have to convince people of a social injustice. It was cancer. Our IGF-1 is also linked to higher levels of fraternal twins. It was protecting ourselves and protecting our children, which is driving this out of the market. Last fall, Monsanto sold RBGH off to another company, Eli Lilly. Demonstrating, yeah, Eli Lilly, right. Monsanto Jr. So what we want to do, by the way, here's your milk on drugs, just say no. In order to ease this out of the market, I have a video, 18 minutes. You can go to yourmilkondrugs.com, or you can buy it from us on our website for $4.95 and make as many copies as you want. And this is 18 minutes to describe all of the trail of whistleblowers and lies and fired FDA scientists and fired Fox TV reporters and the health issues. So if you want to learn more about this, because we're not going to go into it in detail tonight, because it's already on the way out, and I don't want to take my time, because I want to go into the other area, the tipping point of GM crops. GM crops, they're in our food supply big time, particularly the processed foods. So we want to engineer a tipping point, and we can do that together. Again, it is so easy. So I am planning to get you all fired up, so that when you leave here, you're going to have trouble sleeping. No, we'll cancel that one. You're going to have trouble not working on this issue, because you're going to realize how simple it is. In our hands. Within perhaps a year, we can create a tipping point. Now, this is part of our campaign for healthier eating in America. Now, before I go into the dangers of GMOs, just think, how many people in the United States, out of 300 million, what percentage do we need to stop eating GMOs in order to create a tipping point? For Kraft food, to say, well, I'm seeing a loss in market share. I see a trend. We've already removed GMOs from our European brands. We've already moved GMOs from our Japanese brands. It looks like it's happening here. Let's remove GMOs. Not even change our recipe, just tell our supply chain, switch to the non-GM corn and soy, etc. Not very many. Not a high percentage needed, because GMOs give no consumer benefit. They're not going to say, oh, we need GMOs because like trans fats it creates this effect, or like sugar it creates this effect. There's nothing consumer-based on this issue. So many of us believe that 5%, 15 million people, is more than enough. That's 5.6 million households. Now we've taken a huge problem and knocked it down to 5.6 million heads of households or shoppers. That is nothing. This weekend we can, well, maybe not this weekend, we can get to these many people very easily. We know who they are. We know who's receptive. We don't have to convince the couch potato junk food eating person that health and food are related. They don't know they're eating GMOs, and they'll never know we took it out of their food. We can go to where there is receptor cells, to people, to people who are open to this information. And you know who they are. because you are like a hub for those with receptor cells in your community. So we are going to arm the choir tonight. All right, so GM crops, soy, corn, cotton, and canola. Those are the 4 biggies. Most of the soy, corn, and cotton canola in the United States is genetically engineered. There's also papaya, zucchini, crookneck squash, and sugar beets introduced in the fall. So now the sugar supply in the United States is genetically engineered unless it's pure cane sugar. All right? Now, how do you avoid GMOs? 1, buy organic. 2, buy products that are labeled non-GMO. 3, buy products listed on our non-GMO shopping guide. Or 4, avoid the at-risk ingredients, which is a lot of derivatives of soy and corn. High fructose corn syrup, dextrose, maltodextrin, soy lecithin, soy protein isolate. I would guess 90% of processed foods contain a derivative of soy, corn, cotton, or canola, and now sugar beets. So this is how you avoid them when you're going shopping. How do you avoid them when going out to restaurants? If you go to a restaurant that cooks junk food, or excuse me, fast food, then it is processed. It'll contain the soy and corn derivatives and the sugar before they cook it. If they cook from scratch, then most of the GMOs are visible. Corn chips, corn tortillas, corn polenta, soy sauce, soy tofu. What is invisible primarily is the vegetable oil and the salad dressing. Vegetable oil that they cook with and the salad dressing they put on the salad. So you go in and you say, what kind of oil do you cook with? If they say vegetable oil, it's probably soybean. If it's in Canada, it's probably canola. You say, what do you have? You say, I don't eat GMOs, which includes genetically engineered vegetable oils. Do you have anything cooked in olive oil? Can you cook mine in olive oil? What doesn't use oil? And then you can have them prepare something for you that avoids the GMOs if you want to be completely free of GMOs when going out to eat. So now I want you to rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you've been in the last month avoiding genetically engineered foods when going out to eat. 1 means not vigilant. 100 means extremely vigilant. Most people will be 1. All right? So I don't want you to feel embarrassed admitting that you have never gone through, you've never sent your waiter or waitress laps back and forth to the kitchen, as I do every time I go out, to answer these questions. Okay, who's 1 to 20? That should be most of you. Who's 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100? All right, you guys don't eat in restaurants? All right. So now rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you've been not bringing GMOs into your home. So buying organic, non-GMO, etc. 1 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. All right, that's a pretest. We'll ask you in an hour what your plans are for next week. Now, rate yourself from 1 to 100 how active you've been educating people on this issue. Okay, 1 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100, 2,000. Anyone else with me? All right. Now, the reason we're here talking about GMOs is our friendly FDA. What are some of the fun... Now, FDA, what could that mean? FDA. Does anyone have any fun... All right. We won't repeat that for the Federal Dummy Association. Famously deceptive advice. False data. Federal Deaf Agency. Okay. Federal Drug Advocates. Okay. I like that one. All right. Okay. We'll have a contest later. So it was this enforcement wing of the biotechnology industry, the FDA, and the pharmaceuticals. They came up with a sentence in their policy which said that the agency is not aware of any information showing that the foods created by these new methods differ from other foods in any meaningful or uniform way. Basically saying, we don't see any difference, right? And on that basis, they said no testing is necessary. In fact, Monsanto and the other 4 biotech companies that introduce food can introduce a GM food without even telling the Food and Drug Administration. We don't care because they can conclude it's safe. We know of no difference, that this food is no significant difference. Now, 44,000 documents were made public from a lawsuit, and it showed that that sentence was a complete and utter deception, completely the opposite of the truth, the overwhelming consensus, even within the FDA's own scientists, where the genetically engineered foods could create allergies, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems. They had urged their superiors to require long-term studies. But the person in charge of policy, who had been hired because the FDA had been told by the George Bush, the first White House, to promote the biotechnology industry, they recruited from Monsanto's law firm, Michael Taylor. He was in charge of FDA policy and then became Monsanto's vice president. Yeah, it's just a coincidence. He was also on the Obama transition team.
A lot of change.
Yeah. So while he was there, basically, this lie was engineered upon us. And that is why we have GMOs. If they had to do the proper studies that are legally required according to the Drug and Cosmetic Act, they would never have introduced the foods. So the voluntary consultation process, which is technically by the FDA, which the companies actually bring information to the FDA on a voluntary basis, it's technically known as a meaningless exercise. They give summary data. They don't give the actual raw feeding study data. And then at the end of the exercise, the FDA says, you believe your foods are safe. It never says the FDA believes the foods are safe, because it's not the FDA's job. It reminds them that it's their job to determine if their foods are safe. Only one company gave actually raw feeding study data to the FDA. It was the Flavor Savor tomato by Calgene, designed for longer shelf life. It is no longer on the shelf, so it didn't work too well. Now, this company did a rat feeding study, and the brilliant rats refused to eat the tomatoes. Let's hear it for those rats, yeah. All right. Yeah, they got good taste, absolutely. You know, all over the United States, eyewitness reports from farmers, scientists, and reporters say that many animals, when given a choice, avoided GMOs. Pigs, cows, geese, elk, deer, raccoons, squirrels, mice, and rats. In fact, in my book, Seeds of Deception, before each chapter, I do a little vignette called Wisdom of the Animals, and I describe the specific conditions under which these animals avoided GMOs. And there was a description of a farmer who tried to see if squirrels had a preference. So he put an ear of corn on one tree and an ear of corn on the other. One was BT GM corn, one was not. And they only ate the non-GM corn. Even when it was only the BT corn was available, they didn't touch it. So someone else decided, you know, I'll do the same thing. He tried it last year. He bought a bag of BT corn and a bag of natural corn and put it in the garage in the fall. He was planning to do this during the winter, but he forgot all about it. He showed up he saw the bags there in the spring and realized he had forgotten to do the study, but the mice had done the study for him. Breaking open and eating all the kernels of the natural corn and not touching the BT corn. So it's my job to get humans up to the level of animals. And you're recruited to help. So they force-fed the rats the tomatoes, and 7 of 20 developed stomach lesions. 7 of 40 died within 2 weeks. Now, in the UK, which is very pro-GM, especially under Tony Blair, they decided to convince a skeptical public that GMOs were safe by doing rigorous long-term studies. And so they put out a request for proposal asking for the scientist who was going to determine the testing protocols to see if GMOs are safe. And they put 28 different scientists applied. They gave the money to Dr. Arpad Pusztai, the world's leading expert in his field. Worked at the top nutritional research laboratory in the UK, one of the best in the world. Now, Dr. Pusztai had 20 or 30 people working for him at 3 different institutions. And as part of the research, they had a potato that was planned to be introduced into the market. genetically engineered with a gene transferred into the DNA from another plant. That's what genetic engineering is. We'll get to the details. And it created an insecticide. So they took that potato and included it as part of the diet for one group of rats. Not Mickey's mom. That's mice. Another group of rats were eating natural potatoes, and a third group were eating natural potatoes spiked with the same insecticide that the GM potatoes were producing. So GM potatoes, natural potatoes with insecticide. But only the GM potatoes cause sickness, not the potatoes spiked with the insecticide. So what was the cause of the problem? The GMO. The fact that they genetically engineered the potato. Somehow the process caused potentially precancerous cell growth in the digestive tract, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system. Here's a picture of the intestinal wall on the right of the rat that ate the GM potato, showing proliferative cell growth. It's much easier to see in the stomach lining. In 10 days. So Dr. Pustai, around the time he had discovered these things, was invited to speak on television. With permission from his director, he gave an interview, and he described how he didn't think humans should be treated as guinea pigs, and he wouldn't put GMOs in his mouth. And this was huge news in Europe. It was covered all over the continent. Here was one of the top scientists in the world working on a government grant creating the protocols for testing GMOs that would eventually be EU law. That was what they were intended to be. And he describes GMOs as dangerous. So he was a hero at his prestigious institute for 2 days. Yes, I know, we've all heard this before. Tuesday night, Tuesday afternoon, somewhere between 3 and 5, 2 phone calls were placed from the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director. Word has it, it originally came from Monsanto to the Clinton administration, from the Clinton administration to the Blair administration, from the Blair administration to the director of the institute, Professor Philip James. The next morning, Dr. Pustai was fired from his job after 35 years. He was silenced with threats of a lawsuit. They took away the data. They dissolved the 20-member research team. They never implemented the long-term safety testing protocol. Instead, they embarked on a campaign to destroy Pustai's reputation and uphold the reputation of the biotechnology industry. The companies were involved in it. The government was involved in it. But he was invited to speak before Parliament, which allowed him to lift the gag order. He got his data back. And the data is now published. This is from a published study in The Lancet. And it remains the most, yes, it got out. And it's the most in-depth animal feeding study yet conducted. Now, I asked Dr. Pustai, what was your most shocking moment? You know why I asked that question? Some of you do. Because I was writing a book on shocking moments. I had to get Americans to read it. It had to be like, X-Files. It couldn't be like, it had to be something interesting, like the two reporters from Fox who were going to link RBGH to cancer in a 4-part news series. They had to cancel the show because Monsanto wrote a threatening letter, Monsanto's attorney, promising dire consequences to Fox TV and Rupert Murdoch if they went ahead with it. Like Ignacio Chapela from UC Berkeley, who was about to publish information about genetically modified corn contaminating indigenous corn varieties in Mexico. He let the Mexican government know about the upcoming publication, and he told me he was threatened by a senior Mexican government official who implied, we know where your children go to school, trying to get them not to publish. About the FDA that withheld information from Congress about a deadly epidemic that killed 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick, and never mentioned that the food supplement was genetically engineered. So I was looking for shocking moments. And so he told me a story he hadn't told anyone else. I was the only one that asked him that question. He said his most shocking moment was not being fired. It was not discovering the damage to the rats. It was months earlier. He was still a pro-GM scientist in good standing, working at his institute. Professor Philip James, the director, walked in. They invited Pustai's wife, Susan, who worked there also, to come in. And James said, put about 700 pages on Arpad's desk. And see, these are the submissions from 6 or 7 biotech companies for their products. And the agriculture minister is meeting in Brussels and wants a scientific opinion. Now, the reason why James had these confidential submissions is because he was among the 12 members of the committee in the UK that approves the submissions. So Arpad Pusztai looked at these 700 pages, glanced at his director, looked back at the pages and realized this man would never read these many pages, nor would the other 11 members of the committee. They were committee men, they weren't working scientists, and they were very busy. He and his wife, however, had spent more than 2 years designing the ideal testing protocol for GMOs. And they were among the most qualified humans on earth to evaluate the stack. They said, how much time do we have? The professor said, 2.5 hours. Yes. He said those 2.5 hours were the most shocking moment. He said the research was so poor, flimsy, superficial, bad. He said, Jeffrey, it was a turning point in my life. I realized what I was doing and what they were doing was diametrically opposed. I was doing safety studies. They were doing as little as possible to get their foods on the market as quickly as possible. He called the minister and said, I wasn't planning to give you a strong recommendation after just 2.5 hours, but there's not enough information here to allow these foods to be fed to human beings. The minister said, I don't know why you're telling me that. Those foods were approved 2 years ago. They're on the market. So a few months later, when Pusztai realized the damage to his rats from the potatoes, he realized if those potatoes had been tested in the same superficial way that the soy, corn, and tomatoes had been that he read about, the potatoes would have made it to market. They never looked at the organs. They never looked at the brain. They never looked at the testicles. They never looked at the immune system. They didn't look hardly at anything. And then no one read the submissions anyway. What was of greater concern to him, however, was the fact that the soy and corn and tomatoes were already on the market, and they were created from the same process he used to create the potatoes. Remember? It was the process, not the insecticide, that caused the problem. So we don't know if the soy, corn, and other products on the market today are causing these type of problems in our gut. Because even till today, and this all happened in 99 and 98, no one has bothered testing the foods on the market to this level of depth. So what I did was I wrote the book Seeds of Deception based on these kind of stories. And that is how I started this talk, based on a story, right? And so we have a protagonist and we learn about the dangers of GMOs while we're gripped. And you have to read the stories because woven through those stories are the dangers of the health risks of GMOs. So when I gave this book, this became the world's best-selling book on GMOs, I traveled around the world, 25 countries, 30 now, and I was giving this book to senior political leaders around the world, realizing they'll never read it. Just like Professor James never read those 700 pages, these guys won't read it. Now, I got lucky. In Vermont, they gave one to all the legislators, and they actually started reading it, and they got gripped, and one person said it spread like wildfire and was the basis of every conversation on GMOs once it arrived, and was influential in the passage of the first state regulation on GMOs. So it does work, but it's kind of a long shot to get someone who's a lawmaker to read so many pages. So I'm thinking, I need something like a brochure. I need something like this thin to get their attention, and they'll say, summarize it for me. You know, it's like I need to figure out how do I get to the decision makers, and they're going to look at it, and then they're going to give it to their staff. And if their staff has scientists on it, the scientists need a textbook. So brochure, textbook. Brochure, textbook. And then I thought, okay, I'll give it to them. Brochure, textbook. Brochure, textbook. Brochure, textbook. The conclusion. So even if you're like total ADD politician, And you can only read like one sentence. That has all the information. And then it's further elaborated in the main points and commented on by a scientist and then cited and detailed over here. So you can... So 65 health risks, right? I gave this to the Secretary of Agriculture. And I said, I wrote this book for you. You only have to read this side, and then give it to your staff to read this side. See? They said, thank you very much. Can I summarize it? Right. So there's 65 health risks, 20 adverse findings, and 45 theoretical risks. And they're very significant. You'll see a handful of them tonight. And I realized, let's say a senator reads this. They're going to think, well, I'm sure the FDA, our favorite agency protecting Americans' health, is fully aware of these problems and has protected us and taken steps to make sure it doesn't happen in our GM food. So I decided to add part 2. Part 2 shows how the current safety assessments are incompetent to even identify most of the health risks in part 1. And I wrote it slightly different, and I'd explain the navigation in the beginning. I said, those with ADD, they just read the crossheads. That's it. All of them are completely self-contained with the conclusion. Those that want to do a casual read can read what I've written, and those that want to do an in-depth read can read the indented excerpts from expert reports proving that what I'm saying is true. So then I wrote part 3. Part 3, 43 pages showing how industry research is rigged to avoid finding problems. How they have the wrong control group, the wrong detection methods, the wrong statistics, how they dilute and all this and overcook and whatnot, how they have bad science down to a science. And then part 4, why GMOs are not good to feed the world. Which of course, they spent $250 million in 5 years to tell us that GMOs needed to feed the world. So it's obligatory for everyone that talks about GMOs to say, yes, Virginia, no, Virginia, you don't need GMOs to feed the world. It's really a bad idea. Really a bad idea. So what I'm going to do now is change channels from the story version and give you some of the information from the textbook and brochure. And these 65 risks are divided into categories. So we're going to go 5 of the 8 categories that I described of things that can go wrong. And you've already been exposed to the first category, that the process itself creates awesome problems. Okay? Now, this is a picture of a gene construct. Okay? This gene is what we want to operate in corn. So we want to create pesticide in corn. So what we do is we scoop up soil. Inside the soil is bacteria. Including the bacteria is Bt, Bacillus thuringiensis, a particular class of bacteria that produces insecticides. So we take the bacteria, and they've done this already. They just gather the bacteria and the spores, and they use it as a pesticide in organic agriculture, in forestry, in conventional agriculture. But they do something different with this. Here, instead of spraying it on the plant, they take the gene that produces the toxin, make some changes in its code so it works in plants, put a promoter on it, which is an on switch, to turn on the gene 24/7 around the clock so it produces high levels of toxin all the time. Then they put a stop signal at the, whoops, wrong one. They put a stop signal here at the end saying the gene ends here, stop reading. And then they put it into a gun. And then they shoot. Actually, they first make millions of copies, put it into a gun, and shoot millions of genes into a plate of millions of corn cells. And hoping that some of those genes make it into the DNA of some of those cells. This is their precise method of insertion. And then they can't tell which gene got where. And so before they actually make millions of copies, they add another gene in here, which is a marker gene, to tell them which genes made it into the cells. And they typically used antibiotic-resistant marker genes. So after shooting the genes in here, they add the antibiotic, killing all of the cells except the very few that have the gene operating, which means it's now invincible to a particular antibiotic. They take those genes and they clone them into a crop, and now every single cell of the corn has a little spray bottle that sprays a poison called Bt. Now the process of insertion, whether it's done by gene gun or bacterial infection, and the process of cloning creates massive collateral damage. We know what collateral damage is, and it's massive in this case. 2 to 4% of the DNA is different. Most of it are the hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA. Genes can be deleted, permanently turned on, permanently turned off, and there's a holistic response that occurs when a single gene is inserted. Up to 5% of the existing genes change the levels of output, which could be hundreds or thousands of genes from a single gene. So when you create all these changes in the DNA, you create changes in the RNA, in the proteins, and the natural compounds. So for example, soy. They found after the soy was planted, long after it was approved, sometimes it would split in the sun. So they looked in the soy and found, oh, isn't that interesting? Lignin, that woody compound in trees, is up by 20% in the soy. Well, lignin is produced by a complex metabolic pathway that also produces rotenone, a plant pesticide, which is linked to Parkinson's. Then they found that a known allergen in soy as much as 7 times in cooked soy compared to non-GM soy. And then they found a completely new protein that was never intended to be created, which was an allergen also in the soy. So you can see all this is from the massive collateral damage. But when they approve GM crops, they ignore all of this. They look at a handful of known nutrients, but they don't look at all of the things that can go wrong. The allergies, toxins, new diseases, carcinogens, etc. The second cause of problems is that the gene that they put into the crop is designed to produce a protein, and that protein may be harmful. Now, the 2 primary traits are herbicide tolerance and pesticide production. For herbicide tolerance, let me explain. Monsanto scientists found bacteria growing in a chemical waste dump near their factory, surviving in the presence of Roundup herbicide. So, in their brilliance, they said, let's put it in the food supply. So they took the gene that produced the protein that allowed it to survive, and they put it into soybeans and corn and cotton and canola, and now you can spray the heck out of those plants, those Roundup-ready crops, and kill all of the other plant biodiversity, but not the genetically engineered one. So about 80% of all the GM crops in the world are herbicide tolerant, almost all Roundup ready, some are Liberty Link. The rest are almost all Bt toxin producing. Now let's look at Bt toxin. The EPA, which is responsible for the corn and cotton that are registered as pesticides, because they have these little spray bottles in them, they say it's no problem because Bt has a history of safe use, it's destroyed during the digestion system in mammals, and there's no receptor cells in humans anyway, or mammals, so it just would pass benignly through the system if it weren't destroyed. Now it turns out these 3 assumptions are in conflict with published peer-reviewed studies. That hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest got allergic type and flu-like symptoms when they were sprayed with Bt from airplanes, when it was used for gypsy moths. When it was fed to mice, the mice developed an immune response. It survived digestion, and their immune response was as powerful as if they'd been fed cholera toxin. And it turns out that the Bt in the crops is more powerful, more potent, and more concentrated than the natural form. It's thousands of times more concentrated. It's designed to be more toxic. It has properties of a known allergen, which should have caused it not to be approved at all, according to the recommendations by the World Health Organization. So now they've done a few studies with Bt corn and Bt cotton, and in Monsanto's own study that was made public from a lawsuit, there was indications that the rats were poisoned. Toxicity in the liver and kidneys, and indicators for blood pressure problems, allergies, infections or disease, high blood sugar, and anemia. 2 studies came out in November last year, both government-funded studies from Europe. The first from Italy showed Bt corn fed to mice created multiple immune responses. Remember, natural Bt fed to mice created immune responses. Now the Bt corn is giving immune responses. The Austrian government found that the more you give the Bt corn, in this case it was stacked with Roundup, so it was two traits in one, the more you feed the corn to the mice, the less babies they have. And the smaller the babies were. I was just in India. Thousands of farm workers are reporting allergic reactions when touching the Bt cotton. They have rashes and discoloration and wounds all over their bodies. The Sunday India said victims of itching have increased massively this year related to BT cotton. The pharmacy manager said almost every cotton worker from this village suffers from itching. I looked at the symptoms from one medical report of this itching. It turns out the symptoms were exactly the same as the hundreds of people in the Pacific Northwest who got sprayed with BT from an airplane. After harvesting the cotton, they allow animals, livestock, to graze on the cotton plants. Thousands of sheep perished, many within 7 days of eating the BT cotton plants. They also had skin problems and other issues. Like all over the world, in India they could not get proper follow-up by governments or universities into the problems that they'd seen with the BT cotton. One group pleaded with the government and their National Institute of Nutrition to please do a study. They were interested, and then they talked to them for a year, and then mysteriously they just lost interest. So this little non-governmental organization, an NGO, decided to do their own research. They took 9 sheep, and they fed 3 of them Bolgard 1 BT cotton plants, 3 Bolgard 2, and 3 natural BT. Over 30 days, there was a series of symptoms of those eating the BT. By the end of 30 days, all 6 eating the BT cotton plants were dead. This was in February of last year. All 3 that ate the non-BT cotton plants were doing fine. I met them last month. Now, in addition to the sheep, the buffaloes eating the BT cottonseed cakes in the state called Haryana are having reproductive problems like prolapsed uterus and common abortions and premature deliveries and infertility. And the milk, which they rely on for income, is reducing in quantity, quality, and fat content. And there's also skin problems, and many of the buffalo are dying. In one village that I visited in the state of Andhra Pradesh, they allowed their buffalo to graze on cotton plants after harvest for 7 or 8 years. But on January 3rd of last year, they grazed on BT cotton for the first time. All day, one day. The next day, they were unable to move or unconscious. Veterinarians could not revive them for 2 days, and the 3rd day, all 13 were dead. Yes, I told you it gets energy, yes. The post-mortem, I talked to someone who participated in this post-mortem. They said that the lungs had holes in them, the liver was darker, flattened, and dry. And one thing he said was very interesting. There was undigested food in the rumen. Ruminants, like buffalo. They have compartments in their digestive system. They can eat cellulose because in the rumen, the bacteria breaks down the cellulose and sends it to the next compartment. Here, the undigested food was sitting there for at least 3 days while the animal was living, and more when the animal was dead. Undigested. Now, as soon as they said this, it reminded me of a conversation I had had with one of the top biologists of the world a week earlier, about 3 hours from this village. The man's name was Dr. Pushpa M. Bhargava, 81 years old. 25 of his close friends and former students have won Nobel Prizes. He was assigned by the Supreme Court in India to evaluate the approval process of genetically engineered foods. He was asked in February of last year because the Supreme Court received a petition claiming that the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee was superficially rubber stamping the approvals and that they called for a moratorium. And so the Supreme Court asked Bhargava to sit on the GEAC as an invitee. And after 10 months, he wrote a letter and report to the Supreme Court and a letter to the Prime Minister and to the Minister of Health. And he called for an immediate moratorium. He said, they don't even read the submissions. Does this sound familiar? He said, and they never look at adverse findings. He would bring them adverse findings, and what they said every time was, oh, he's been discredited. Oh, she's been discredited. Oh, the study has been discredited. It didn't matter if it was the best journals in the world. They would just say the same thing, discredited. So he actually, when he wrote the report, the GEAC said, oh, Bhargava is discredited. They tried to say he has no experience publishing DNA or RNA research. He laughed when he told me this. He said he has 5 articles in Nature and 2 in Science, and he has more articles published on DNA and RNA than the entire GEAC put together. They also tried to say he has a tradition of being anti-government. He sits on the National Security Committee, has access to every document in the government, and all the heads of all the intelligence agencies are on the same committee. He's been on more than 100 committees. So they just, it's like, he's like an automaton, discredited, discredited. So I loved sitting with him for 3 to 3.5 hours, videotaping him, talking. We came to the exact same conclusions with completely independent analysis, me working with more than 30 scientists over 2 years to produce Genetic Roulette, him reading 600 studies and documenting it on his own. And he said when I started, he said, I think that the health problems you're seeing in the United States that have grown over the last decade are large part due to GMOs eaten by Americans. Now, one thing he said to me that I had never heard before. He said, the sheep eating the GM cotton that are dying, they had shriveled intestines. He thinks this shriveled because he says maybe the food doesn't get into the intestines. He hypothesized that the Bt toxin kills the bacteria in the rumen. So when I saw a week later the same thing happening with buffalo, I called him up. And I said, very interesting news. He said, yes, see, I told you. Now, a month later, or 4 weeks later, a study was released by Vandana Shiva's organization in India, where they found that the Bt cotton produces the Bt toxin in the soil, and it kills a lot of the bacteria in the soil, including the bacteria that breaks down cellulose to create humus, or humus. Humus, not hummus. That's different. Thinking about eating it. All right, never mind. And so I was speaking with Vandana Shiva last week, who was in Orange County, and she said it's the same kind of process. It doesn't break it down, and it may kill the bacteria in the rumen that breaks down the cellulose, and it's killing the same type of bacteria in the soil. So it's interesting about bacteria in our gut. We'll get to that a little later. I asked these people, these are the people I met at this village, how many of you personally have had itching from Bt cotton plants? And about 9 of them are raising their hands over here, and if you scan to the left and scan to the right, there's more people raising their hand. They also told me that 26 of their sheep and goats also perished after eating Bt cotton plants. In Germany, 12 cows died on a German farm after eating a certain variety of Bt corn. Farmers in the US say pigs and cows became sterile a few years ago from a certain variety of Bt corn. In the Philippines, people inhaling the pollen from a nearby cornfield developed all sorts of very serious symptoms. And during the time of pollination only, when the same seeds were planted in 4 more villages, the next year the same symptoms returned during the time of pollination. The first village also reported deaths among water buffaloes, chickens, and horses, and unexplained human deaths associated perhaps with the Bt corn. So now all of these problems may be a result of the Bt itself, which is intended to be created in the plant. But the third category of problems is that the protein that you create may be very different than the protein that was intended. The first reason for that is that the transgene that has the code to create the amino acid sequence, that transgene that carries its own sequence, can be scrambled, mutated, or truncated during the process of insertion. Like MON810, which is Monsanto's famous Bt corn that caused a lot of these problems we saw earlier. It turns out 30% of it was truncated right off. That stop signal which says stop reading here, it's gone. So when it creates the amino acid sequence, it starts taking the code from the transgene, and then it starts taking the code from the actual corn itself, producing a protein that was never intended. Studies in Europe suggest that the transgenes rearrange over time spontaneously because they found different genes, arrangements, different sequences in the same variety as looked at by 2 different laboratories. How would you do a safety test on that? If you test it today and it changes tomorrow, it could produce a completely different protein than the one you tested. Even if the transgene is exactly the same, it could be read differently and produce multiple proteins. And even if it produces the exact amino acid sequence you're looking for, it might be folded differently or have different molecular attachments, which can turn a harmless protein into a deadly one, and that apparently happened in Australia. They took a gene from kidney beans and put it into peas, and the peas were designed to create an insecticide, and the peas passed all of the studies normally used to get on the market. They could have been on the market in the United States, they could have been on the market in Australia, in Europe. But before they commercialized it, they decided to do one more thing. Let's do an advanced test, they said. It had never before been done on GM food crop, not before and not since. They did an advanced immune test, and they tested the protein from the kidney bean in its natural state, and it was harmless to the mice. Then they tested the exact same protein with the exact same amino acid sequence when it was produced in the genetically modified pea, and the mice had inflammatory reactions suggesting that the pea had now become deadly for humans, that it might create anaphylactic shock. And so they looked into the protein and found that there was some subtle difference in the way the sugars attached to the protein when it was put into the pea. And they were so surprised because these are so closely related species. And they decided, well, let's not commercialize it. And it was planned to be sent to India. So they decided not to commercialize it. They buried the peas. And when Monsanto's representative was asked in Europe to comment on the cancellation of the peas in Australia, he boldly says, this shows that the regulatory system works. What it shows is how they spin. The truth is exactly the opposite. It shows how the regulatory system fails. No regulatory system in the world ever required that advanced study. The peas had already passed all the tests. None of Monsanto's studies, products, had ever been tested that way, and all of them take genes not from closely related species, but from different kingdoms, bacteria and viruses. So they may be creating deadly anaphylactic shock. Fourth possible problem is that there's more herbicide residues in herbicide-tolerant crops, and it's accelerating because of the increase in herbicide-tolerant weeds. So it's hugely increasing, like in 1 year, 38%. These chickens that were fed herbicide-tolerant Liberty Link corn died at twice the rate. But this was an industry-funded study, so even a doubling of the death rate was not statistically significant. Fifth possible problem is that genes might transfer to our gut bacteria or even into our own DNA. Now, this was a very serious problem according to the FDA scientists and according to the 44,000 documents made public from the lawsuit. The scientists, the division, wrote a memo about the antibiotic-resistant marker gene, saying it would be a serious health hazard. They were concerned that it might transfer to the bacteria inside our gut. But the biotech industry said, don't worry, genes are destroyed during digestion. We've heard that before. And they said, so transfer is impossible. So they finally tested this in the only human feeding study ever conducted on GMOs. The only human feeding study ever conducted and published on GMOs. They took 7 human volunteers they had colostomy bags. They had their lower intestines removed. Not for the study. And they fed them a soy burger and a soy milkshake, genetically engineered, looked inside the colostomy bag, and were surprised to see how much intact genetically engineered soy had survived the passage through the stomach and the small intestine. But in 3 of the 7 volunteers, inside the DNA of the bacteria in their gut was the gene that had been found in the bacteria in the chemical waste dump near Monsanto's factory, that had been put into soybeans eaten by these people at some previous meal, and these were British citizens that don't eat a lot of GM soy. And somehow it had transferred and integrated into the DNA and continued to function. Meaning long after we stop eating GMOs, we may still have these foreign proteins produced inside our gut. So gut genes transfer, and they are optimized to transfer. Plant genes don't transfer typically to gut bacteria. They're longer, they're not similar, and if they do transfer, the promoter doesn't work, or the bacteria doesn't know how to read them. All of those problems are dismantled with GMOs. that use bacterial genes and promoters that do work in the gut bacteria. So we may be colonizing the bacteria of North America inside our gut. And if we did, all those experts in gut bacteria who we've heard today would talk about allergies, immune system problems, gut gastrointestinal problems. That's what we're seeing. The promoter transferred to gut bacteria, and that can turn on genes at random, causing an overproduction of anything. The antibiotic-resistant marker gene might transfer, creating super diseases untreatable with antibiotics. The Roundup Ready gene did transfer. We don't know what it can do, but it has properties of a known allergen. And if it's an allergen and it's produced continually inside us, that is really serious information. The Liberty Link gene might convert something in the Liberty Link corn into herbicides. The viral gene that's used in papaya, zucchini, and crookneck squash might produce proteins that suppress our defenses against viral infection. If the Bt gene from corn chips transfers to our gut bacteria, it might turn it into living pesticide factories, possibly for the rest of our lives. We don't know because this was a UK government-funded study. They stopped after they found the problem and never looked at anything else. So let's take a look at GM soy and just see if there's any problems with the GM soy. Soon after GM soy was introduced to the UK, soy allergies skyrocketed by 50%. In a small study, they found in a skin prick test a reaction of one individual to GM soy, but not to non-GM soy. There's actually many reasons why GM soy might create allergic reactions. The increased herbicide residues, the 7-fold increase in the known allergen, digestive enzymes reduced in animals fed GM soy might create allergic reactions to the entire spectrum of food proteins. The new potential allergen created, the Roundup Ready protein is allergenic. These are all in my book. I don't have to go into the details, but there's many candidates for why GM soy introduction might have caused the increase in soy allergies. Mice and rabbits fed Roundup Ready soy had altered cells, enzymes, or gene expression in 4 organs: liver, pancreas, testicles, and heart. Here's a picture of the liver cell, of the nuclei of the liver cell. If you look at the outside, it's kind of rough all around it compared to the smooth membrane here. Inside the nuclei is the nucleoli, also changes. Inside the rat livers, you can see clear differences in the cells here compared to those of not fed the natural soy. The testicles of rats fed GM soy were a different color. You can see it in the organ and you can see it in the cells. When mice were fed GM soy, they looked under a super strong microscope and they found changes in the structure and function, including changes in the young sperm cells. Then they looked at the embryos from pregnant mice and found changes in their DNA as well. A Russian scientist fed female rats genetically engineered soy flour. Starting 2 weeks before conception, more than half of their babies died within 3 weeks, compared to only 10% death rate when the mothers were fed non-GM soy. The look of the two were completely different. Many of the GM offspring were much smaller. These are the same age. They tried to mate the offspring from the GM-fed group, and they could not mate. Now, this scientist, like most of the scientists that discover adverse findings, instead of having follow-up to her research, she was victimized, threatened, cut off from doing any more GM research. Now, one of the criticisms lodged at her study, which was accurate and appropriate, was she never did a biochemical analysis of the feed. So maybe there was some toxin that had worked its way into the soy flour that was actually responsible for these astounding results. But after repeating this 3 times with similar results, coincidentally, the rat chow, which was being fed to all the rats in the facility, was now GM soy based. It just flipped by itself. She couldn't do any more studies. She had no controls. But after 2 months, she asked her colleagues, how are the babies doing in your study, the rat babies? The infant mortality rate had jumped to over 55%, suggesting it wasn't a toxin in her particular batch, but it was generic. So when she couldn't do any more studies, someone tried to comfort her, a fellow scientist. She's a senior scientist at the Russian National Academy of Sciences. A fellow scientist said, well, maybe the GM soy will solve the overpopulation problem. Well, Alex Jones loved it when I told him that on the radio. He said, wait a minute, Mr. Smith, I want you to say that again. See, I've been telling you about this. If GM crops are so bad, why don't we see more problems? Well, we saw a lot of problems in the 1980s from a genetically engineered food supplement called L-tryptophan that killed 100 Americans, caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. It took 4 years to discover the epidemic was going on, and they almost missed it. And the only reason they discovered it was because the disease had 3 simultaneous characteristics. The disease symptoms were new, they were acute, and they came on quickly. What if it were cancer, heart disease, obesity, diabetes, common diseases? The tryptophan would still be on the market. What if it were superficial symptoms like frequent colds or memory loss? Or memory loss. Or memory loss, yeah. What if it took 20 years to discover the problem? What if the symptoms didn't come up until the next generation? It would still be on the market. So what about the GM crops currently on the market? We don't know if they're causing problems because there's no post-marketing surveillance, no human clinical trials, no evaluation of all the changes that occur in the plants. Approvals are based on assumptions and industry research which is rigged. I'd like you to rate yourself from 1 to 100. How vigilant you'll be next week at avoiding genetically engineered food in restaurants. I said it in the beginning, which you may have forgotten by now. You know, you have to eat where they cook from scratch and ask what kind of oil they cook with. So who's 1 to 20 on this one? Okay, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. I noticed a shift, did you? All right, rate yourself from 1 to 100 how vigilant you are going to be next week at avoiding bringing genetically engineered foods into your home. 1 to 20. 1 to 20? 20 to 40? 40 to 60? 60 to 80? 80 to 100. Yes, but I told you in the beginning how to do it. We got a shopping guide, buy organic, there's ways to do it. Now, how active do you plan to be on helping stop this? And before you say, rate yourself, I want you to reflect on what just happened here in this last hour. Okay? Many of you made this a turning point in your digestive life. Yeah? Then all of a sudden, that old craft food, that Nabisco thing, that whatever it was, has moved into the category of not food. Because now it represents a threat. And all of a sudden, just by hearing the truth about GMOs, you have a different relationship with these brands. So we're talking about creating a tipping point and how easy it is. Because I'm about to tell you how easy it is to make that tipping point in individuals around you so that they join you in this increased vigilance. So now, rate yourself how active you plan to be on educating people on this issue. 0 to 20. 20 to 40. 40 to 60. 60 to 80. 80 to 100. I've come to the right place. So the reason I wrote a book about health and not environmental concerns was the strategy of the tipping point. But in reality, the environmental concerns may be worse. Because the genes you release into the environment today cross-pollinate, the seeds move, and you cannot recall all of them. You can stop a lot of them. But it contaminates the gene pool. So the genes we've already released may outlast the effects of global warming and nuclear waste. And this is an infant science. Now, I'm not against the possibility that someday we can manipulate genes in the DNA for the betterment of health and the environment. I'm not against genetic engineering per se. I'm not against human gene therapy that's not inheritable, that may just save the life of one person with a defective gene. I'm not against using genetic engineering in a laboratory to study the DNA, possibly to create medicines, as long as they respect the changes that can occur, not like L-tryptophan. but to feed the products of an infant science to the population and release it into the environment where it'll never be recalled with our current technology. That is irresponsible to the highest level. And it is not only irresponsible to the highest level, it is an emergency. It is an emergency that we must pay attention to now. They should have paid attention to it back when the FDA was saying no further questions. They should have paid attention to it when they were first doing manipulations of DNA. In fact, they did. They said, we only have to do this in very carefully contained headquarters, in laboratories. But all of a sudden it became open, and now they do it in high schools, and they create all this bacteria and flush it down the toilet. So we have to be extremely careful and quick, because the plans by Monsanto are really disastrous. Monsanto's plans, I want to describe to you how it was described by Arthur Andersen Consulting in a 1999 January conference in San Francisco. They said how they worked with the Monsanto executives. Arthur Andersen Consulting, they were also Enron's consultant. So they said to the executives, describe your ideal future in 15 to 20 years. And the Monsanto executive described a world in which 100% of all commercial seeds in the world were genetically engineered and patented. And Andersen Consulting worked backwards from that goal to create the strategy and tactics to achieve it. Another biotech representative at the same conference projected a 95% takeover of all commercial seeds in the world by 2004. They were on track to replace nature. Virtually everything we eat, and also the non-food item. But 3 weeks later, their ideal future crashed. Remember this guy? I opened my book with what happened. A lesson from overseas. When Susan answered the door, she was startled to see several reporters standing in front of her. More were running from their cars in her direction, and she could see other cars and TV news vans parking along her street. But you all know we can't speak about what happened. We would be sued. It's okay now, the reporter from Channel 4 television interrupted, waving a paper in front of her. They've released your husband. He can talk to us. Susan took the paper. Arpad, come here, she called to her husband. Arpad Pustai, a distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, was already on his way. As his wife showed him the document, the reporter slipped past them into the house, but Arpad didn't notice. He was staring at the paper his wife had just handed him. He recognized the letterhead at once, the Rowett Institute, Aberdeen, Scotland. It was one of the world's leading nutritional institutes and his employer for the previous 35 years, until his sudden suspension 7 months ago. And there it was, clearly spelled out. They had released their gag order. He could speak. The document was dated that same day, February 16, 1999. In fact, less than 20 minutes before, 30 reporters had sat in the Rowett Institute press conference listening to its director, Professor Philip James, casually mention that the restrictions on Dr. Pustai speaking to the press had been lifted. Before James had finished his sentence, the reporters leaped for the door. They jumped into their cars and headed straight to the Pustai's house on Ashley Park North, an address most were familiar with, having virtually camped out there 7 months earlier. Now those 30 reporters with TV cameras and tape recorders were piled into the Pustai's living room. Arpad Pustai read the document twice. As he looked up, the reporters started asking him questions all at once. He smiled and breathed more easily than he had in a long time. He had all but given up hope. Now he finally had the chance to share what he knew about the dangers of genetically engineered foods. Within a week, 159 column feet were written in articles around Europe. Within a month, 750 articles. And within 2 or 3 months, the tipping point was achieved, and Unilever, Britain's largest food manufacturer, decided to publicly commit to not use any more GM ingredients in their European brands. And by the end of the week, so did virtually everyone else. It was an avalanche. Safeway, McDonald's, Burger King, Nestle's, etc., for their European brands. But not for the US, because Project Censored, the media watchdog group, described the Pustai affair as one of the 10 most underreported events of the year. You ask the average American, have you ever eaten a GM food in your life? 60% say no, while they're eating a GM food. 15% say I don't know. So the entire success of the biotech industry in the United States is based on consumer ignorance, which actually leaves them extremely vulnerable. Extremely vulnerable. How do we stop the genetic engineering of our food supply? How do we get 15 million Americans, 5.6 million households, the tipping point to stop eating GMOs? If we could achieve it with the general population, if we could get Fox Television, if we could get ABC, Oprah Winfrey could end the genetic engineering of the food supply in 60 minutes. It's that vulnerable. One 60-minute TV show, one film by Michael Moore, one film by Al Gore. Any of these could end the genetic engineering of the food supply. But we don't want to give away our power and hope. We want to actually do it ourselves. So which demographic groups are ready to hear this message? Well, the first is clearly health-conscious shoppers. How many of them are we? 28 million Americans buy organic on a regular basis, 54 on an irregular basis. But very few conscientiously avoid their GM ingredients in their non-organic purchases. But if you ask them, like the rats and squirrels before them, they'd say, if I knew, I would avoid. So we are getting the information out to them as part of our campaign for healthier eating in America. We have non-GMO education centers available for stores nationwide. We have inside there, we have the non-GMO shopping guide available both in the centers and for free to every natural food store. Alongside the non-GMO shopping guide, we have a health risks brochure. The risks brochure says why to avoid GMOs. This tells people how. We also are asking the retailers through our retailer campaign kit that they download on our site. They have a staff education material, staff quiz. They get to show the world according to Monsanto, one of the most powerful GM. How many people have seen this? This makes you want to break something. This gives you energy like nothing before. You're like, what can I do? The 30 minutes after seeing this film are the most powerful, the most powerfully motivated a person is in their life to get involved with GMOs. So we have a whole handout and a way to channel this energy. So having home showings and free public showings is a powerful activism that you can do. You don't have to memorize a thing from this lecture. Just turn the DVD on and start playing. We've also packaged this with Your Milk on Drugs, Just Say No, and with a 3-minute hibernating, so that means I'm not getting any juice. Oh, it's not plugged in. It's not plugged in. Well, it lasted a long time. All right, so World According to Monsanto is very powerful, and we also realize when you finish the World According to Monsanto, it gives you no direction. And so we have a 3-minute video called What We Can Do, which describes the tipping point and the 4 targeted demographic groups that I'm about to share. I don't need this because I know what's coming. I also have an audio CD called Don't Put That in Your Mouth, which is basically a 70-minute talk that I give that you can make copies of and distribute. And we also have materials for websites so that the health-conscious shopper, wherever they go, whatever major website they go, they have the shopping guide online and information in series forms about all the different health risks that can go on. I can create a lot of articles and have based on this text. You know, one on soy allergies, one on corn and cotton allergies, one on toxic and reproductive problems, one on the incompetence of the FDA, one a review of the World According to Monsanto. They're all on our site at Responsible Tech. Actually, the easier one to remember is healthiereating.org. And you can use them on your site. You can print them, put them in magazines, etc. Is it plugged in? All right, so I'll do it. It's not giving me a source. All right. So we have the health-conscious shopper, and we are going to them through the natural food industry. So the reason I was here last week with Vandana Shiva and all is because they had the big natural food industry conference in Anaheim. And there's huge momentum there to drive GMOs out of the food supply for both removing any remaining GM ingredients from the natural food products and to educate consumers about the health risks. The other demographic group is health practitioners, healthcare practitioners, who are now prescribing non-GM diets. Let's see if I'm right with that one. Nope, school meals. All right, so school meals, that's the other next one. So school meals are under intense scrutiny right now because of ADHD and obesity and diabetes. So the transition is happening. They're trying to make better school meals now. So now is the time to educate people about the health risks. So for this, we have a video called Hidden Dangers in Kids' Meals. Instant activism. Just add DVD and stir. You show it to a group, they all want to get involved with it. A lot of people want to get involved with a GM-free school campaign. We have a 60-page manual. We have pre-written articles that you can customize for your local paper, a whole strategy, so that everyone gets on board to protect the children, which is a very natural, biologically driven motivation. So we'll ride on the wave of school meals to reach the parents and the local papers that cover whatever happens in the schools. So we've got religious organizations. Imagine when a major religion believes that GMO means God move over, it's over. The evangelical Christians do not have to actually circulate the non-GMO shopping guide. They just have to threaten to do so, and GMOs will leave the next morning. Healthcare practitioners are now prescribing non-GM diets. So what we have is patient education material. They leave the genetic roulette in their waiting room to freak them out. And when they give them a non-GM diet, they give them these two to say, here's why and here's how. Now, these are the 4 targeted demographic groups. Each one of them is large enough to hit the tipping point on its own. Health-conscious shoppers, parents of young kids, religious organizations, healthcare practitioners. When Kellogg's believes that doctors are prescribing to their customers not to eat Kellogg's cornflakes because it might turn their intestinal flora into living pesticide factories, Kellogg's will make a change. Right? So this is something that we are driving towards. Now, I'm invited to speak to a lot of groups, and I don't usually accept because I'm really busy trying to organize, because I figure I have to reach, if I'm trying to get 15 million people by the end of the year, which is when I'm trying to target a tipping point by the end of the year, how many thousands or tens of thousands do I have to reach each week? And what I'm doing is I've packaged information for different organizations. So they already reach 20,000, 50,000, 500,000, 2 million. So they can use their website and their newsletter and their magazine or magazines itself to get the information out. So my job now is I've done the strategy. I have a very small staff. We're packaging the information. But what excited me about coming here, when I got a sense of what kind of people come here, is that I have a feeling I'm going to walk away with some allies. And so what I'm going to do is to tell you, I'm going to go through the packaging of how I use these materials so that you may decide to use them as well. The World According to Monsanto is the powerhouse. You can loan it out. You can set up free public showings, etc. I've already given some information about what else is in here. Hidden Dangers in Kids' Meals. It also has a 15-minute bonus material from Appleton, Wisconsin, where they changed the diet from the normal junk food that kids eat in schools to natural, healthy, freshly prepared food. They happen to eliminate almost all GMOs at the same time. The behavior of the kids changed dramatically, immediately, from an out-of-control school to an orderly school. So it's added motivation, especially for parents with out-of-control kids. I have these packets of 50 non-GMO shopping guides and 50 health risks brochures. They're part of the tips that you can give to your taxi. You can leave them with your waiters and waitresses. You can give them to your families. If you loan out seeds of deception, you can tell people, just read the first chapter. It'll hook them. Right? That makes it easy. Just read the first chapter. Likewise, if you open up the World According to Monsanto and you get the, don't put that in your mouth, you give that to someone and say, listen to it in your car. Don't put it by your computer. They'll never listen to it by the computer. Listen to it in your car. Or if they have an MP3 player, they can do a podcast download off of the site. The genetic roulette, that's for decision makers that use their left brain, whether they want to read it quickly. So if you're trying to get a school principal, a medical doctor, anyone that does the left brain, this is the left brain book, and compared to Seeds of Deception, which is the right brain storybook. Okay? So, and you can actually, when you give them this book, you open it. And you say, see, you just have to read the left side. And of course they're going to read the right side if they find the left side's interesting, right? And in the very beginning it says how to navigate the book, suggestion to readers. So you can even point to that. So this is what you get them involved. You say, just read the first page, just read the first chapter, just listen to the car, just look at the left side. So that way you can have your own lending library, you can have showings in your house. And so what I'm going to ask for is this. What I would like to get, I'm going to be very bold and big, and I may not get this number, but hey, I'm going to try. I'd like to get 50 people who really want to influence 50 others. Influence by passing information on, because these come in packets of 50, so it's a convenient number. And then I put all these together so you get everything, including the packets, for $55 instead of $101. So I have a package price to make it easy for you. And if you can't afford it, a lot of stuff is available on the website, so don't fear. I cater to poor people too, having been one most of my life. So I want to ask, I'm looking for 50 people who want to join me in taking responsibility to end the genetic engineering of the food supply. In whatever way you feel committed to, but to do so in an active way. And that means making a decision now, not tomorrow. Now, because the information is fresh. And as you all know, as you can try to remember last year's conference, it's kind of vague memory. There was a step, as you get further away from the information, the energy is gone, the memory is gone. So now is the time that you may want to think, what is it that you want to do with this information? How do you, or if you want to contribute to the tipping point, what would that look like? And so I want to ask, how many people would like to help me this way? Okay. And for those that didn't raise your hand, whatever you want to do, whether it's just your kids you want to influence, your mother or your father or your friends or where you get your food, but I'm interested in but I want to focus for a moment on those that want to do something in a big way. And so if you have a store, it's one topic. If you have a kid in school, you're an administrator in school, it's another topic. If you're a healthcare practitioner, it's another group. So these will have specific strategies that we can build around you. But anyone can start a GM-free school campaign. It's all there in the downloadable, or we can give you the 60-page manual. So to wrap up, I want to say this. I will be here. I've got enough for about 15 or 16 people who want the whole package, and the rest will be upstairs tomorrow morning. I'll be here tomorrow. I didn't want to carry everything all down at once. I'm really impressed in what I'm seeing here today. Because what I get from you, I said I wanted to get a sense of who you were, but I was also getting a sense all day today and yesterday. What I'm seeing here are truth warriors. Warriors for facing the truth and warriors for doing something about it. And I really feel like I'm part of the family here, the family of truth warriors. And we each have our own area we work on, and sometimes we come together and find more strength. And here's an area which may be one of the greatest threats to the health and environment of our world. But it's one of the easiest problems to fix because of the link to health and the link to food and the ease with which we can drive the tipping point because GMOs give no consumer benefits. So it's set up for us. It's low-hanging non-GMO fruit. And so I want to say this, that very few organizations have their mission to end GMOs. It's my organization's mission. There's a handful of them. So when I go and I speak to an environmental group or a health group or some kind of freedom organization, they can always make the excuse, I don't want to be involved with this because we have our own mission. But if everyone felt that way, there'd be like 6 of us that have the mission to end GMOs, and we cannot do it alone. So in this case, this is something that we have to join hands. Whether it's for ourselves, whether it's for the 750 trillion gut bacteria inside us, whether it's for our children, or whether it's for future children, or whether it's for the entire ecosystem. The karma of the entire ecosystem and the entire planet and all the people on the planet are tied up with our success and are rooting for our success. Thank you very much.